In 2016, investigators cleaning up a corporate waste site in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, made an unusual discovery. They found a collection of old business records, letters, reports, internal memos from a company called the United States Radium Corporation. The documents dated back to 1917. The investigators could not touch them with bare hands because the paper itself was radioactive. The files had been sitting in that building for nearly 100 years, still glowing, still dangerous, still carrying the evidence of what the company had done and what it had chosen not to say. The United States Radium Corporation employed hundreds of young women to paint the dials of watches and military instruments with a luminescent radium-based paint called Undark. The women were told the material was perfectly safe. They were instructed to sharpen their paintbrushes by pressing the bristles between their lips. They did this dozens of times a day, every day, for years. They painted their nails with the glowing paint for fun. They painted their teeth so they could smile in the dark and surprise their boyfriends. One of them noticed that when she blew her nose at the end of a shift, her handkerchief glowed green. Nobody told them that radium, once absorbed into the human body, binds to calcium and lodges in the bones. Nobody told them it would stay there forever, emitting radiation from the inside, dissolving their jaws, crumbling their spines, giving them cancers that had no name yet because nobody had seen them before. Nobody told them because the company already knew, and the company had decided that what its workers did not know would not cost the company anything. It cost the women everything. Think about the last time someone in authority told you something was safe. Your doctor, your employer, a label on a product, a government agency. We extend that trust automatically because the alternative, second-guessing every professional assurance we receive, is not a way most people can live. The women who walked into the United States Radium Corporation factory in Orange, New Jersey in 1917 trusted the same way. They were young, they were working class, many were recent immigrants, and they had been hired into one of the best-paying factory jobs available to women at the time. They had no reason to doubt the people above them. The people above them had every reason to make sure they kept not doubting. This is the story of what the company knew when it knew it, and what it chose to do with that knowledge. It is also the story of 5 women who decided, when their teeth had fallen out and their jaws were dissolving and they had been told by the most famous scientist in the world that there was no hope, that they were going to make someone answer for it anyway. To understand how the Radium Girls were possible, you have to understand what radium meant to the world in 1917. Marie Curie had isolated radium in 1898, and in the nearly 2 decades since her discovery, it had acquired an almost mystical reputation. It glowed. It generated heat from nothing visible. It seemed to defy the ordinary rules of matter, and in an era when science was transforming daily life faster than most people could comprehend, something that defied ordinary rules was easy to mistake for something miraculous. American advertisements in the 1910s and 20s sold radium water, radium toothpaste, radium face cream, radium chocolate. One newspaper headline from 1921 announced, "Radium to extend life to 100 years." Nobody thought to ask what happened when it got inside you and stayed there. The United States Radium Corporation, originally called the Radium Luminous Material Corporation, was founded in Orange, New Jersey in 1914. When the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, demand for luminescent instruments exploded. Military watches, compasses, altimeters, aircraft gauges, all of them needed dials that soldiers and pilots could read in the dark. The company needed workers, and it needed them fast. It found them among the young women of Orange and the surrounding towns, recruiting through schools and churches and word of mouth. By the spring of 1917, it had hired approximately 70 women for the dial painting studio at its plant on Alden Street. The work paid well. At $0.50 per dial, a fast painter could earn significantly more than the average factory wage. The studio was bright and airy compared to most factory floors. The women sat at long tables, mixing their own paint and applying it to watch faces so small that the smallest measured barely 1.5 inches across. The brushes they used were made of fine camel hair, and the bristles had a tendency to spread and lose their point. The solution the company instructed them to use was simple. Press the brush between your lips, shape the tip, dip it in the radium paint, and apply. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. 6 times per dial, 250 dials per day. One of the women hired that spring was 18-year-old Grace Fryer. Grace had hazel eyes that her friends found charming, a quick laugh, and the kind of steady hands that made her good at close detail work. She joined 70 other women in the painting studio and learned the technique her supervisors demonstrated. The paint tasted of nothing. The glow was pretty. Sometimes the women used it to paint their nails or dot their cheeks before a shift ended, so they would sparkle walking home through the evening streets. It felt festive. It felt modern. It felt like being part of something new. What none of them knew, and what the men who ran the company already did know from the scientific literature available at the time, was that radium behaves inside the human body exactly like calcium. When ingested, it travels to the bones and stays there, releasing radiation continuously into the surrounding tissue for the rest of the person's life. There was no way to remove it. There was no treatment for what it did. The owners and scientists at the United States Radium Corporation knew this. They wore lead aprons and used tongs when handling radium themselves. They carefully avoided the painting studio. They said nothing to the women at the tables. Grace Fryer worked at the factory until 1920, when she left for a better-paying job as a bank teller. She was 21 years old, and as far as she knew, she was in perfect health. She would not stay that way for long. 2 years after leaving the factory, Grace's teeth began to ache. Then they began to loosen. By 1922, she was losing them one by one, and the jawbone beneath was developing a deep, painful abscess that none of the doctors she consulted had ever seen before. Her back began to hurt. Her joints swelled. The hazel eyes that had once charmed her friends clouded over with constant pain. She was not alone. By 1924, at least 50 women who had worked at the orange plant had reported similar symptoms. 12 had died. The deaths were quiet, individual, easy to miss as a pattern if you were not looking for one, or if you were actively working to make sure no one found one. The company was working very hard to make sure no one found one. When a dial painter died and her family sought answers, the United States Radium Corporation moved quickly. Company representatives contacted the doctors who had treated the women and threatened legal action if their findings were published or shared. In the most documented cases, the company pressured physicians to amend official causes of death away from anything that might suggest occupational illness. The amended records attributed deaths to syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that would destroy the dead women's reputations, cast doubt on any concerns they had expressed while alive, and ensure that no connection between their work and their deaths would ever enter the public record. The company did this deliberately, systematically, and with the specific goal of preventing the women or their families from ever collecting compensation. Meanwhile, the radium continued its work inside the bodies of the women still living. The condition that would later be named radium jaw saw jawbones become so porous they could crumble under a dentist's touch. In the most severe cases, the jawbones separated entirely from the skull. Women lost not just their teeth, but the bones that had held them. Their spines compressed, their hips fractured without falls. And through all of it, they continued to be told by company-approved doctors that their problems had nothing to do with radium. In 1925, a New York dentist named Theodore Bloom became the first medical professional to publish a paper connecting the dial painter's symptoms to their work, coining the term radium jaw in the Journal of the American Dental Association. The same year, pathologist Harrison Martland began publishing studies confirming that radium ingested into the body lodged in the bones and released continuous radiation. The science was becoming impossible to ignore. The company responded by hiring its own expert. Frederick Flynn of the Institute of Public Health at Columbia University was brought in to examine Grace Fryer and report on her condition. He told her his examination showed she was in excellent health, as good as his own, he said. He told her there was no connection between her symptoms and her former work. What Grace did not know was that Flynn had no medical degree, that he had been paid by the company, and that his examination was not a medical consultation. It was a piece of theater designed to delay her understanding of what was happening to her body and to give the company another expert voice to cite in court. When Grace finally learned the truth about Flynn's examination, she made a decision. She was going to sue. It took Grace Fryer 2 years to find an attorney willing to take her case. The United States Radium Corporation was a well-resourced company with political connections in New Jersey, and the legal theory Grace needed, that an employer could be held liable for deliberately concealing health hazards from employees, had almost no precedent in American law. Most attorneys she approached declined politely, or not so politely. The case looked unwinnable, the company looked untouchable, and Grace looked like a young woman who would almost certainly be dead before any judgment could be rendered. On May 18, 1927, a young Newark attorney named Raymond Barry agreed to take the case on contingency. He filed suit in the New Jersey State Supreme Court on behalf of Grace Fryer and 4 other former dial painters, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, Quinta McDonald, and Catherine Schaub. Each woman was seeking $250,000 in compensation for medical expenses and pain and suffering. The press, which had largely ignored the deaths of individual factory workers over the previous 5 years, suddenly paid attention. The 5 women were photographed at their attorney's office. The photographs were devastating. These were women in their late 20s and early 30s who looked decades older. Grace wore a back brace to sit upright. Several could not fully open their mouths. Edna Hussman's jaw had been partially removed in an attempt to stop the spread of the necrosis. The New York World put the story on its front page. Newspapers across the country followed. The phrase, "radium girls," entered the public vocabulary. The company's legal team went to work immediately. United States Radium Corporation denied all charges. It denied that the women's conditions had any connection to radium exposure. It produced medical experts, some paid, some simply credulous, who testified that radium in the amounts the women had encountered could not cause such damage. And it filed motions. It filed motion after motion, continuance after continuance, delay after delay. The strategy was not subtle. The company's attorneys were waiting for 5 sick women to die. Each postponement was a calculation that by the next scheduled hearing date, the case would have simplified itself. In January of 1928, the 5 women appeared in court for the first time. By that point, 2 of them were bedridden and could not travel without assistance. Not one of them could raise her arm to take the oath. The first hearing was followed by another delay. The defense requested a continuance until April. The court granted it. When April arrived, the company's witnesses were unavailable. They had, the defense explained, gone on vacation to Europe for the summer. The most prominent journalist in America at the time was Walter Lippmann, a columnist for the New York World whose work appeared in papers across the country. Lippmann had been following the Radium Girls case and had written several pieces on it. When the April adjournment was announced, he wrote that the delay was one of the most damnable travesties of justice that had ever come to his attention. He described 5 women who had been poisoned by their employer, who were dying, who had finally found a lawyer willing to fight for them after 2 years of searching, and who were now being told by the legal system that the company's witnesses needed to go on holiday first. Public pressure reached a level the company had not anticipated. Marie Curie, by this point the most famous scientist in the world, commented on the case from Paris. She expressed deep sympathy for the women, and she was honest about what that sympathy was worth medically. Her experiments with radium, she said, had convinced her that if the poison was taken internally, it was practically impossible to destroy it. There was no hope, she said, of ever removing the radium from their bodies. She suggested they eat raw liver to manage the symptoms of radiation-induced anemia. It was the best medical advice available in 1928. A trial date was set for June. Just days before it was to begin, the United States Radium Corporation settled out of court. Each woman received at least $10,000, a fraction of the $250,000 each had sought. They received a $600 annual pension for as long as they lived and coverage of all medical expenses. The company did not admit liability. It did not admit that it had known about the dangers of radium. It did not admit that it had falsified death certificates or hired false medical examiners or threatened doctors who tried to publish their findings. It paid the money, closed the case, and moved on. Quinta McDonald died the following year at the age of 34. Grace Fryer died in 1933, also at 34. Catherine Schaub died the same year at 30. Edna Hussman and Albina Larice survived somewhat longer, but none of the 5 women lived to see middle age. The inventor of the radium dial paint itself, a scientist named Sabin Arnold von Sokocki, who had founded the company, died in November of 1928. He was the 16th known victim of poisoning by radium dial paint. The settlement of 1928 did not end the story. More women from dial factories in Illinois and Connecticut filed similar lawsuits through the 1930s. In 1938, a woman named Catherine Wolfe Donahue became the central figure in a case against the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. A case that drew national attention again and resulted in another settlement that the company resisted until the very end. The United States Radium Corporation itself continued operations under various reorganized corporate identities until 1980, when it was finally dissolved. The factory site on Alden Street in Orange, New Jersey, where Grace Fryer and her co-workers had sat painting watch dials through the 19-teens and 20s, was designated a federal Superfund contamination site. The Environmental Protection Agency completed its cleanup of the Orange location in 2006. Remediation work at additional sites connected to the company's operations was still ongoing decades later. The legal legacy of the Radium Girls was larger than any of the individual settlements. Raymond Barry and labor reformer Alice Hamilton used the evidence from the New Jersey case to negotiate new safety requirements at radium dial factories, including protective equipment and training that had never previously existed. In 1949, Congress passed legislation guaranteeing compensation for occupational diseases and extending the statute of limitations for workers who became ill from long-term exposure. A direct response to the procedural injustice the Radium Girls had faced when the company argued their claims were time-barred. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which sets and enforces workplace safety standards for every worker in the United States, was established in 1970. The regulatory framework it created built on the legal ground the Radium Girls had broken 4 decades earlier. Radium-painted watch dials were gradually phased out through the 1970s in favor of safer materials. The last woman identified as one of the Radium Girls, May Keene, died in 2014 at the age of 107. One of the few who had left the factory early enough to escape the worst of the exposure. Back to those documents found in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania in 2016. The paper records the investigators found, the internal corporate letters, the medical reports, the correspondence between the company's executives and the lawyers and doctors they had employed or pressured or paid, were radioactive. Not metaphorically dangerous. Physically radioactive, still registering on a Geiger counter nearly a century after they were written. The records had to be handled with protective equipment. The originals were disposed of as low-level nuclear waste. The content had already been digitized, and those digital copies now sit in the National Archives catalog under identifier 4978844, available to anyone who wants to read what the United States Radium Corporation knew and when it knew it. Grace Fryer pointed her brush between her lips approximately 6 times per dial, by her own testimony. At 250 dials a day, 5 days a week, for roughly 3 years, that is close to 1 million separate moments in which she ingested radium because her employer told her the substance was harmless and she had no reason to believe otherwise. She spent the last years of her life in pain in a back brace, fighting a company that tried to outlast her in court. She died at 34. She also helped ensure that no American employer can legally do to its workers what the United States Radium Corporation did to her and the women who sat beside her at those long tables in Orange, New Jersey in the spring of 1917. The documents glowed. The women changed the law. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other out.